Hi, my name is Crystal,
Hi,
I'm
I'm
Seth,
Josie.
and I'm Seth.
and we're talking about age weighting.
So age weighting is the idea that certain years of life are more valuable than others, and so health in those years should be weighted more heavily. Some systems might think people in their 60s are the most important, while others emphasize the developmental period. Imagine two patients, Jack and Jill, come into a hospital needing life-saving treatment. Jill is young, and Jack is old by measures of years lived. You only have one treatment for their disease, and you cannot split it. The cure would extend each of their lives by 10 QALYs, but you can only treat one of them, and each will die without it. With no age weighting, there is no clear answer who to treat. You might as well flip a coin. However, if you accept the premise, for example, that we should save younger people, then Jill should be chosen for the cure. Depending on your approach, age weighting can also extend to situations where Jack would actually gain more from the treatment than Jill. For example, Jill would only gain 8 QALYs to Jack's 12, but because hers are weighted more heavily, she would still receive the treatment. So now we're going to talk about age weighting in practice. Age weighting was used in the GBD in 1990. Practically, we would not use age weights to make the sorts of treatment decisions that you see in the case of Jack and Jill. However, age weights are very important for policy decisions. For example, the government might choose to cover conditions that disproportionately affect young adults rather than those that primarily affect infants. In the Global Burden of Disease study, Murray applies different weights to DALYs for different people of different ages. Infants and older people are weighted less, and middle-aged people are weighted more. What this means is that if country A and B both had 400 unweighted DALYs attributable to their population, but 75% of the DALYs in country A came from 30-year-olds, and 75% of the DALYs in country B came from 70-year-olds, then in the Global Burden of Disease study, country A would appear to have a greater burden of disease than country B. Age weighting like this has also been used by the World Bank and in the World Developmental Report. Why might we want to do this? Well, it starts with the empirical observation that when surveyed, most people would prefer to save the life of a young adult over that of a child or an elderly person. It is no surprise that people would prefer to save the life of a young person over an old person because the young person has more years left to live. But it is surprising that the people would prefer to save the life of an adult over a child. Moreover, this observation holds that not only for saving the lives of people of different ages, but also for extending life by 1 year. However, whether or not we should incorporate these preferences in the form of value weights will depend on whether we think people hold these preferences for a good reason. So when Murray created the age weights for the GBD, he relied on several different studies. There are even more studies that have also been used in later papers on age weighting. And these are the surveys that are usually justified or used to justify why age weighting is used. So you can see the Institute of Medicine conducted a study on vaccine priority in 1986, in which a panel of public health experts selected relative valuations of death at each age. Murray himself conducted a survey with 116 participants from developing countries in the context of tuberculosis training. And finally, there were also the Geneva meeting and a training course held in a similar way to Murray and the International Institute of Medicine. You can see all of those graphed out on figure 1.13 on the left side of the screen and see the curve that all of those took on. Another study at the Cardiff Health Survey in 1989 with 721 adults found that 94% preferred saving a 5-year-old over a 70-year-old, 80% preferred saving a 35-year-old over a 60-year-old, and 34% preferred saving an 8-year-old over a 2-year-old. For that same question, 46% couldn't choose, and 22% chose the 2-year-old over the 8-year-old. Finally, in 1996, Johannesson and Johansson found strong population preferences for non-uniform age weighting, so that 1 QALY for a 30-year-old was equivalent to 3 for a 50-year-old and 9 for a 70-year-old. The next step after observing that people hold these preferences is justifying why they do this, as this points to the validity of using age weights. These are the main three justifications for age weighting. First, people might value health differently from different stages in their lives. Do I derive the same amount of happiness or welfare from being healthy at the age of 30 as I do at the age of 70? Maybe not. This argument, while briefly addressed by Murray, does not seem to get as much attention in the literature. So for the purposes of this presentation, we will just refer to this idea as the personal value of health argument. The second set of arguments are the efficiency-based justifications for age weighting. The idea here is that a young adult is more productive and therefore their health is more important to society and should be weighted as such. Murray calls this the welfare interdependence justification and argues that efficiency includes non-monetary contributions to society, like taking care of children. The third set of arguments are the equality-based justifications for age weighting. Commonly referred to as the fair innings argument, this type of justification points out that it is not such a tragedy when an old person dies because they have already enjoyed a full life. We should therefore attach greater weight to an additional year of life for a young person. Importantly, Murray does not significantly address the fair innings argument. So most criticisms of the age weighting done in the Global Burden of Disease study are based in appeals to equity.
So now I'm going to talk about why Murray chose to age weight overweight based on income. So probably the most notable aspect of these three justifications is that the efficiency and equity-based justifications are directly conflicting with one another. However, when arguing in favor of a second proposition, that the only two non-health characteristics that should be considered when calculating the burden of disease are age and sex, Murray argues that his proposition specifically excludes income as a middle ground between similarly conflicting efficiency and equity-based arguments. So why shouldn't we also exclude age? As Murray goes on to argue, the important difference between income and age is that income can significantly over or underrepresent a person's contributions to social welfare. A child might not earn an income, but they can still contribute to others' welfare by helping around the house or by bringing joy to their parents in other ways. Age is a more suitable variable to capture welfare independence. Although this will differ somewhat from country to country, whether they're earning a large salary, raising children, or working for a nonprofit, people in their early years of adulthood tend to be best equipped to contribute to others' welfare. So the fair innings argument presents a different method for valuing dollies. It points to our basic intuition that that the death of a young person is especially tragic because they have not yet lived a full life. The basic version of the fair innings argument allots people some number of years before which they have not enjoyed a full life, and after which they are considered to be living on borrowed time. It applies some weight greater than 1 to all dollies prior to that age, and applies some weight less than 1 to all dollies after that age. I think the age that was typically used or initially used was 70 years old. Another version of the fair innings argument made by Alan Williams extends the argument in two ways. First, it makes comparisons, not based on the number of years a person has lived, but instead based on the quality adjusted life expectancy they are expected to experience because of their social class or some other determining factor. Second, it applies different weights to people of different ages based on their life expectancy. The extended fair innings argument seems more reasonable to us because it doesn't value a person's life less just because they spent many years in a coma, and because it suggests that the death of a child is a greater tragedy than the death of someone approaching old age. Under this approach, a younger person may find their health is weighted less than someone older because their life expectancy is longer. So we have two basic approaches to creating final age weights, and we think that all three arguments for age weighting are compelling reasons to want to age weight. So this leaves the challenge of combining all three justifications into a single weight. One way to do this is to simply survey people and ask them to make comparisons between extending the life of people of different ages. This is basically the methodology taken in the surveys used by the Global Burden of Disease study. Alternatively, we could investigate each of the three justifications separately and then combine each of those separate weights into some final age weight. This is the approach suggested by Williams in his criticism of the GBD study. You might think that this second approach is more trustworthy and informative than the first option. For example, you might think there are some questions that most people are poorly equipped to answer. However, the challenges associated with creating age weights in this more complex fashion are significant. Williams argued in favor of simply combining his fair innings weights with the GBD's weights, but this might lead to double counting equity concerns because it is likely that some respondents subconsciously included the fair innings type concerns in their responses to the surveys that led to the GBD's weights. To avoid this overcounting, we would have to be careful to use methods that isolate concerns about the personal value of health from efficiency and finally from equity. And perhaps, most difficult, we would have to determine how to combine those three concerns into a final weight. So first, we would want to measure the personal value of health. However, it's unclear what that even means. We might want to survey people of different ages and ask them how happy they are. Past surveys of this type have shown that people generally consider themselves happier at the beginning and end of their lives. Alternatively, we might want to ask questions about preference satisfaction, overall life satisfaction, or ask some psychologists. Although it's unclear exactly how we should formulate the question, I think that our ability to independently measure this represents one of the greatest advantages of taking a more complex approach to age weighting, because people are perhaps less conscious of just how much happiness varies depending on age.
Next, we would want to measure welfare interdependence. Of course, we could gather economic data about average salary, hours worked, and unemployment rates to gain some insight into this question. However, this of course does not capture the entire picture. We would also likely want to survey family members about the joy derived and costs imposed by each other at various ages. And finally, we would have to determine some way of weighing the monetary and non-monetary costs and benefits against each other. Alternatively, we could simply ask people how much people of different ages contribute to society. Given the challenges associated with merging economic data with other measures of welfare interdependence, this would likely be a better method for measuring societal contributions. And then finally, we would want to create a system accounting for the importance of equity of life years lived. We once again might want to return to public opinion to determine how much we would be willing to sacrifice in the name of equality. We might also want to turn to philosophers for insight into the relative value of equality, as there will be complex moral issues with which to contend. At which point should two lives be considered equal? Should we take a classic fair innings approach where a number of life years is set as a finishing line, or instead create rolling weights based on group life expectancies, as Williams does? Should we concern ourselves with equality of opportunity or actual experience years? However, philosophers vary significantly from utilitarians to Rawlsians regarding the trade-off between equality and efficiency, so their insights would likely only carry us so far. Having established weights independently on the basis of each of these three justifications independently, we would also need some method for combining them. Like mentioned previously, we would need some method to weigh the relative importance of efficiency and equity, but presumably we could produce surveys that would help solve this issue. However, the more difficult problem is weighing the personal value of a person's health against their contributions to the welfare of others. This is the most challenging obstacle to measuring age weights on the basis of each of the three justifications separately. You could ask people standard gamble questions to determine the economic value of 1 year of life taken at different points in their life. However, when asked this question, people will unavoidably place some weight on their contributions to the welfare of others. Too much weight for their answer to represent the personal value of health, but also too little weight for their answer to represent the overall value of that year of life to society at large. This obstacle looms so large that it alone gives us strong reason to prefer the GBD's method over a more complex alternative. While in an ideal world with perfect access to information, this four-step approach might work. It's clear from our examination how many pitfalls and issues one might encounter in trying to actualize this in the real world. Measuring the weights for each justification independently has its own problems, particularly when measuring welfare interdependence. However, combining all of these concerns into a final system of weights is what ultimately makes it an unrealistic approach. There are too many opportunities for error. Furthermore, it's not clear that the age weighting system used in the GBD and the World Development Report are not already reflecting these priorities beyond simply welfare independence. Importantly, none of the age weights reached through surveys were below 0, though it might be reasonable to assign specific age groups like children between the ages of 0 to 5 negative weights for their contributions to productive society. Such results suggest that the age weights provided are reflecting a preference for equality, like equal access to some amount of life experience, and personal value, like the fondness for childhood, as well as welfare interdependence. Admittedly, there is reason to be skeptical of the surveys that led to the GBD's weights. For example, you might be worried that while included in some form, personal value and equity concerns did not weigh heavily enough in the minds of the respondents. Perhaps future surveys should provide respondents with literature regarding each of the various justifications for age weighting so that they are conscious of these issues before giving their response. Of course, asking respondents such a large question with so many different underlying issues will lead people to make mistakes, to under or overweight certain issues. But as long as we don't have reason to think that their responses are mistaken in a biased way, we should feel relatively comfortable in the age weights derived from these surveys. Therefore, ultimately, we feel that an approach like the one used in the Global Burden of Disease study best captures all of the motivations for age weighting into a single set of weights.
Thank you for listening.
Thanks.